Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure, as always, to have you with us today. It's also a great pleasure to be joined here by Nick Zaiac, who is the new town administrator of Arlington. Nick was recently appointed and started work at his new job on June 1st, so a little over 2 weeks into it now. We're going to pick his brain and see what's going on in Arlington and what his perspective is on some of the things underway down there. Nick, great to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate your time. I guess just to get us started, tell us a little bit about your background and what you were doing before you became the town administrator, and maybe what attracted you to that job.
I started out, I'm initially from Lancaster, Pennsylvania in Amish country, and then I went and spent about 10 years in Washington, D.C., first doing my undergraduate degree, then working as an administrative assistant, and then getting a master's degree, and then being a policy scholar at a think tank for a couple of years. So I kind of floated around in Washington for a decade, realized that Washington was not the place for me. And somewhere in there, I met my wonderful wife, Allie, who is from this region, Bennington County, and with deep family roots in Arlington proper. So that's what attracted me to this job. It's a place that, when I realized that Washington wasn't my long-term life city, we certainly wanted to move to Vermont and be back in a place that's a little bit smaller. And we got our wedding here in Arlington about 2 years ago, 18 months ago at this point. And really kind of learned the town, planning a wedding in this place where you don't have cell phone service in some little pieces of town. And that when this job came open, I saw it on the Vermont League of Cities and Towns website, but it also had it forwarded to me by 3 or 4 different members of the community and my family. So it was the right opportunity at the right time, and I'm really happy that the Arlington Select Board was selecting me for this job.
Well, that's about as big a jump as you can make from Washington to a town like Arlington. that is a change of scenery, for sure. So what will your role be in conjunction with the select board? As a town administrator, there's a bit of a difference between that and the town manager position. I guess maybe what is the difference between a town administrator and a town manager? What makes those two jobs different?
So a town manager is laid out in Vermont state statute. It has some more extensive authority. It's a more kind of classic council manager relationship where the manager has a little bit more independent authority. As an administrator, I have very little independent authority. I am a person who is here to carry out the tasks that the select board sees fit. That said, a job like this certainly has a lot of autonomy in day-to-day operations, things like that. So a manager is just going to be a slightly different job description with slightly more formal authority.
All right. Well, like I said at the start here, you've been in the post now for all of 2 weeks and probably know everything that's going on in town already. But in the time that you've been here, and we're sort of applying for the job and kind of, I'm sure, doing your research on Arlington and what was going on. What's emerged in your mind as sort of the biggest issues or concerns or things that you will need to tackle as we go forward the rest of the year?
So the number one issue in everyone in Arlington's mind, it feels like, is the cost of living. That's a big issue in a lot of towns in Vermont, but in Arlington in particular, the housing is fairly expensive for the region. And we find that we have a lot of commuter traffic because it's so expensive and there aren't places for the people who work here to live here. So that is what helped give birth to the Arlington Area Renewal Project, which started 3 years ago, winds down this month, and they were instrumental in having the town realize that they needed someone on staff full-time to be here running the day-to-day operations of the town so that the select board could focus on governing as they are tasked to do by voters, and as many other towns in the state, including most of our neighboring towns of over 1,000 people that operate. So Arlington was a little bit behind the curve, and it was behind the curve in a way that was causing it to be expensive. So one of my jobs here is to find ways that we, as the community and that the select board can change to make the town a little bit easier and cheaper to live in, and make it so those that it doesn't become a kind of rich retirement community or a kind of land of ski rentals and things like that. It's a town where people who work in Vermont can live.
Well, that's a pretty big. There's a lot of aspects and moving parts to reducing the cost of living. And I'm sure it's one that just about every community in the country probably would say, yeah, let's do that. I mean, is it mainly driven, do you think, by real estate and housing costs, or are there some other factors in play here?
I think there's a number of factors in play here. Housing costs certainly matter, but making sure that the taxpayers are getting great value for money with every project that's done, that projects are overseen efficiently, that projects are bid properly and in accordance to state rules, that they're done accordance to the rules that are in place for a reason, so that the town doesn't get sued, or that we aren't causing damage to other people, for instance, downstream, so that we're doing our job as members of the greater community of Vermont to carry out the tasks that a select board should be doing. This town in the last couple of years lost something like 100 years in experience between longtime members of the select board leaving, staff turnover, things like that. That is irreplaceable. But what makes it easier to replace that is when people do things on paper, in writing, and where I can go and find who has done work for this town and who has done great work for this town. We have to make sure that every contract this town writes is properly bid, and so that we as taxpayers are getting the value that we deserve, and the value that other towns that have followed these rules for it more kind of to this more in their spirit actually are getting. We can't afford to fall behind by people cutting corners on the rules for expediency, and that's something that you can't do when there's no one working full time.
What about broadband? That's been another subject I've heard come up on a couple of occasions, that there are at least parts of the town where broadband and cell phone coverage is at best marginal. Is that another area you've been hearing about or focusing on in some way or another?
It's certainly something that I've heard a little bit about. Arlington is really fortunate in that the portion of homes that don't have broadband internet access compared to most towns in the state is really, really low. we're extremely fortunate in our communications union and the work of the utility providers in Bennington County already, that we're kind of central. It's helped make sure that, for instance, the internet in my house in Arlington is faster than I could get in DC. The build out here was fairly simple. So still matters in the kind of outlying areas of town, especially in West Arlington and in the hollows, where that is not necessarily the case, where that will require further subsidy for further work. And it's something that certainly matters to me. My wife works on the internet. She cannot do her job without extremely high-speed internet. And one of the reasons we picked Arlington was that was an option. There are a lot of towns in the state that I couldn't be a town administrator in.
One of the other areas I remember hearing some discussion about at the select board level and also at some of the renewal project meetings I went to was like the town infrastructure, water and sewer issues, which is one of those subjects I suppose causes a lot of people who aren't really involved in it to have their eyes glaze over, but it's really quite important. It makes a big difference in terms of well, what businesses could do. For instance, if a shop wanted to have, let's say, a little outdoor cafe or whatever, they might not be able to do it because the town water or sewer capacity wasn't high enough. Is that an area you've been hearing a bit about, or figure that there's some attention that needs to be paid to that?
As much as I hate to make people's eyes glaze over, this is the issue where I've probably spent more time on this in my first 2 weeks than anywhere else. Water and sewer issues are prominent within the town. In part, we are not a town that has a village attached to it. Central Arlington and East Arlington are part of Arlington more generally. But there are and the town is a municipal water utility. We brought our water company in-house a couple of years ago after it spent 100 years as a private company. There have been some growing pains with that. The tension between ratepayers and taxpayers is real, and it's one of the same things that gave birth to the villages in the first place years ago. So managing the different interests of those who pay water rates and those who do not is a huge challenge. About 1 in 4 Arlington residents is connected to municipal water, and our water company is doing reasonably well under the leadership of Bursnow, but it certainly has some growing and formalization to do. We hope to update our water ordinance at some point to make this a little bit easier, but the town is still fairly new to the water business, and one of the things I'm hoping to do is make that a little bit easier as we deal with whether to extend the water system, what repairs need to happen, and then how does that interact with the wastewater side? The wastewater side is similarly important. That is our water quality. Almost 2/3 of the town rely on wells. So we can't afford to have pollution contaminate any of that. So as such, much of the sewer issue is a state matter. They're the ones who cite septic tanks, things like that. But we certainly have a lot of figuring out to do what we want, what the plan is for wastewater, how we're going to pay for it, and if we actually need a formal wastewater infrastructure with a sewer component, or we can continue to get by with septic tanks as we have so far. It's certainly a challenge. And we're hoping to seek a grant to have our wastewater capacity infrastructure studied either later this year or into next year to get some expert analysis of this sometime soon.
Well, yeah, that is a big project, like you say. I mean, when I've seen other similar projects being done in other towns around the area, it's a very disruptive kind of process. Streets are closed, lanes are closed, whatever, and it's a big overhaul. But obviously, one that at some point after a town gets to a certain size is probably highly necessary. You mentioned something there, though, in your last answer that caught my attention because I remember that, again, this was another subject of one of the AARP meetings there back a couple of years ago, and that's that whole issue of grant writing. They had one speaker come in one evening and talk about grant writing, and is that an area that I'm assuming you already have some experience and understanding of how that process works. So applying for all sorts of grants, maybe not just water and sewer ones, will be probably a big part of your job as well.
Absolutely. And that said, a grant management is not, the core day-to-day of anything. It's, a couple of days of work for anyone in a given year for most municipal officials. There aren't that many grants out there in the state of Vermont specifically, and ones that are for things that are more extensive than studying something. That said, I do have a grant writing experience. I came from a think tank where I did do a bunch of grant writing to support my own program. And so this is certainly something I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be part of, but we also rely on the work of the local nonprofits who work with us to seek grants. There is a local recreation nonprofit that recently secured a grant to study a potential recreation center through the town, but led by the nonprofit. So a lot of that is coming from the community itself, looking for what the community needs, what the community wants, and then coming to the town and saying, help us with this. You're the ones who need to co-sign on this grant application and are tasked with helping manage this grant, and whether this grant is going to ever become something that needs taxpayer subsidies.
Of course, we're still, just to pivot a little bit here, we're still in the midst of the whole COVID emergency situation. And I guess I just wondered, in a relatively brief time you've been here, how do you see Arlington being impacted by the COVID emergency? And is there a pathway that's emerging out of that and kind of back to, well, I hate to use that overused word normal or normalcy, but kind of something a little more closer to what we used to remember. Has the COVID emergency really been something that's really kind of caused some other initiatives maybe to kind of get stuck, or what's been your sense of it?
So there were certainly some delays that were part of that. Some of our infrastructure work is behind where it should have been because of the early work limits on that kind of activity. I think Arlington is fairly well positioned to return to normal fairly quickly once travel restrictions start to be lessened. Vermont has had some of the stronger restrictions on out-of-state people coming into the state for this entire crisis. I had to spend 2 weeks in quarantine when I first came here, so I had to get up here 2 weeks before the job started. So as such, there are certainly small businesses who are hurting. Arlington certainly does rely on the tourism trade, and for a substantial kind of portion of its economic activity, it has a lot of history, a lot of scenery, and has a lot of hotels per person, especially small bed and breakfasts and things like that can't really afford to lose businesses or lose the rentals that they've lost. But once those restrictions start to ease, we expect to see kind of a fairly swift return to normalcy. Arlington, unlike a lot of other kind of towns nearby, we are not very reliant on the retail trade at all. The number of small businesses that our retailers can be counted on, well, not two hands, but not many more than two hands. But so we've been fortunate in that regard, but that doesn't mean that those businesses aren't important to the community, that we hadn't had the meeting places that the town relied on. There are a lot of people who are really lonely and haven't been able to see their loved ones, and that is manifested in public in various ways. But we believe that, especially with restrictions on sports like have been lifted, that the Arlington Recreation Park has been hopping with activity every day. And that's been a great sign. So stage one is very much behind us. Some of our town is reopened. When this next stage happens, we expect to be back to normalcy fairly quickly.
Are there any plans to do any further work on down at the rec park? Speaking of which, I know that's been talked about a little bit over the years. Do this or do that. Any initiatives planned down there that might be in your future?
So the current initiative is we already have approved and are waiting for installation of new lights at the fields at the rec park. I'm also currently, and was discussed at our previous select board meeting, looking at replacing the netting at our softball field. So those are a couple of points. I'm also now the nominal head of Parks and Recreation in the town, so I'm personally responsible for a lot of that. I was out there taking measurements for this netting yesterday. So those are two. We're also having a couple $1,000s worth of tree work done at the rec park to make it so the lights are actually shining onto the fields and are not being in behind the trees. So Arlington is extremely committed to the rec park, and it's a hub and one of the pillars of town. So we certainly are working to get the most out of that facility that we can. And I certainly welcome any feedback from the community if they think that there are things that should be going on or shouldn't be going on, or if they're kind of low cost ways we can bring extra activity to that park.
Yeah, well, as you say, it certainly is a hub of the community, a real centerpiece of the town, and not many small towns that size have a park that size with its own 9-hole golf course. I guess just to kind of wind things up here, and you're the perfect person to ask this question. It suddenly occurred to me as we were in the middle of this conversation. One of the sort of big existential questions that Vermont as a state, and a lot of small towns have been having, or were having anyway, prior to the arrival of the COVID emergency, was the concerns about our declining or stagnant population, the fact that it was an aging population. I think we're still second behind Maine in terms of that dubious distinction, but definitely right up there near the top. And for the past several years, there's been a tremendous amount of discussion about how do we reverse that trend. So you're exactly the sort of person that the state wants to have here. How do you think Vermont, and let's say Arlington in particular, perhaps, and maybe Bennington County, can position itself to be a sort of place where younger folks might want to move to and would feel this is where they could, raise families and pursue their professional and personal interests at the same time. Is there any signs of any glimmers of hope out there, do you think, or are we still kind of stuck?
I think there are some glimmers of hope. We know that there's going to be pressure to be building up country with global warming, things like that as time goes on. That is kind of the looming big world thing that is going to push people to want to and need to live in places up like Vermont. But that means we're competing with Maine and the Adirondacks and other upcountry places that are just as desirable and just as beautiful to live in. But how does this place outcompete all of those. It's making sure that that is a place where that people don't face undue restrictions on what they can and cannot do in these towns. If restrictions on building, restrictions on land use need to be grounded in some kind of constraint that is not, I don't like that, or so-and-so doesn't like that, so that can't happen. It needs to be grounded in an economic rationale. These towns should be coming down to the stormwater issue or the wastewater issue is the constraint. It's not the loud people are the constraint. So going through all of our rules, making sure that we only have the rules in place that are necessary to protect public health, welfare, and safety, and not the kind of luxuries that are trying to micromanage your neighbors and putting the town between you and the people that you live near. That is not a recipe for growth. That is a recipe for stagnation. And making sure that the town does not play favorites. That's a rule of law matter. If I am not being exactly neutral in the matters of the town, that's going to deter someone from wanting to build here. If someone waits 3 years to get a little infrastructure project that's going to take half an hour done, that's unacceptable. But that happens in Vermont all the time. And we cannot afford to let things slip. We have to be treating this like we're competing. And every single one of these rules is a thing that could be the little thing that keeps someone from picking here instead of and so they choose to live in Maine or in New Hampshire or in the Adirondacks. So the only way we're going to be able to do this is getting government back to exactly what it's here for, and not using it to intervene in the disputes of your neighbors, so you don't have to be the one who is the bad guy and say to your neighbor, your junk car is a problem, can you please deal with it?
Yeah, well, boy, I say that rings a bell. I mean, it's certainly true. Many small towns in rural areas around the country, like Vermont, face the same problem we do. I'm sure there's probably communities in Iowa and Nebraska that probably are worried about the flight of their young folks to Chicago or Milwaukee or wherever. And while here we talk about kids going to Boston and New York, and keeping the folks who are already youngsters who grew up here is, of course, another aspect of that. But that's probably the subject for another extended discussion a little bit later. But that'll have to do it for today. Nick, thank you so much for your time, and good luck in the new job. I know there's been a lot of excitement and anticipation surrounding your arrival, so I hope it all goes well.
Thank you so much.
Well, all right, and we'll see you down at a select board meeting one of these days when things get back to quote unquote normal.
Absolutely, I look forward to it.
All righty, take care and have a good day. And thanks again for all of you for being with us today. Hope you've enjoyed the show, and we'll see you again the next time. Have a great day.